roundhouse as it stands today is only a portion of the original roundhouse. When it was constructed in 1918, it was a full roundhouse with 42 stalls, roads or tracks. In 1973, a portion of it was demolished because at that time the steam engines that worked here had been removed. We didn't need all the facility. The costs to repair it were more than the cost to demolish it, so it was an economic decision to take down part of a roundhouse. But they did leave us with this area here. We have 4 stalls here which showed the heavy engineering arrangements for steam engines on this side of the roundhouse, including drop pits for both the standard engines in service up until 1918, plus the 57 class. There are 4 special roads for them. They were introduced in 1929, and the original setup did not have the capacity to lift the wheel sets out of the 57 class, so they had to upgrade those facilities. Okay, I'll do a quick explanation of the drop pit setup here. This is the 57 class version. The way this works is the locomotive is brought on top of the pits. The driving wheel set that needs to be removed is lined up with this operation mechanical equipment here. There is a 2 metre long piston and jack mounted down the bottom of the tunnel, and that lifts a frame which comes up on the guide rails. That then supports the axle set, and the whole axle set is lifted off the rails against the springs and the suspension. Once that's been raised, we can remove the 2 girders, the boards, undo the keepers that hold the wheel set in place, and the whole wheel set can be dropped down on that platform and moved around to any one of the roads in the workshop for being brought up and then worked on. Typically this road would be left vacant so that the wheel sets can be moved into the workshop to my left. This locomotive is 3112. It has come in here for attention to the bearings. They're plain bearings on the axles. They were damaged and needed to be removed. So we have 2 driving wheel sets that have been removed from this locomotive. This set here down in the pits is the trailing set, and in front of the locomotive is the leading set. The only set that's on it now is the main driving axle. This is the Wellington Shed. It is our workshop. The 2 loco depots in Goulburn were combined in the 1930s, and the original 2-road locomotive shed was where all the workshop equipment was housed down near the station. They needed a new building up here to put all the equipment in when they combined the 2 depots, and they chose to disassemble the locomotive shed at Wellington. During the Depression, it was like an unemployment relief scheme. So this building, which had been built in 1888, was disassembled into its components. They were loaded on some trains, brought down here, and it was re-erected as our machinery shed. That happened sometime around about 1930 to 35 when the depots were being combined, and all the equipment from the old locomotive depot plus some extra equipment was brought up, and the shed was populated. So this was the workshop from about 1935 up until about 1986 when the depot closed. This is our museum display. We call this our Railwayman exhibition, where we try and put a little bit of information about all aspects of the railways, not just steam engines, but all the other necessary operations that took place behind the scenes. Here's an article on the Andera pay bus incident we mentioned earlier. That was the only known partly successful robbery of a pay bus. Happened in 1942 during World War II. There was an explosive charge put on the track by the perpetrators, which blew the pay bus off the track and unfortunately killed the 3 operators that were involved in that vehicle. This is a wash basin from a wooden sleeping car built from the 1920s onwards. They were usually made out of brass and they were chrome plated, and the idea was that they would operate with a water tank in the roof of the carriage. You would open this valve and then you could do your washing. When you closed it up again, the water would run out the bottom through a pipe onto the track. This is a train control diagram from when Goulburn was a train control centre. That's a 24-hour period across there. Down this side we have all the various stations that were included in the control area for our centre. The double track down to Cootamundra, single track branch lines to Cooma and also out to Cowra. There were 3 shifts usually for a day for the controller, so they're about 8 hours each. And on the diagram you can see the various trains. A blue line indicates the timetabled train path, and the black line indicates the actual train path. A good example over here is we have lines for SL1 and SL3. SL1 was the Southern Aurora, SL3 was the spirit of progress. They ran about 10 minutes apart. And not surprisingly, the black line is almost coincident with the blue line because they were our premium trains.
And are these passenger or?
They're both passenger and freight. That's an up train heading towards Sydney. This is a down train heading away from Sydney. On the branch lines, you needed to make sure that the trains crossed at a crossing loop or siding where they could pass each other. On the double track, it didn't matter where they passed because there was an up train and a down train, so they were separated and they could just follow each other. Well, generally, a lot of people left school very early, usually as soon as they'd finished their finishing certificate, I think it was called in those days, or even beforehand, as soon as they turned 15, they could join up with the railways. They would join in a very junior position, such as a porter or a cleaner or something like that, or a general dog's body, so to speak. And as time progressed, if they had the competence, they would move up through the ranks. Typically at a loco depot, they could go into the technical or engineering side and become fitters, or on the locomotive side, they could progress up through becoming a shed fireman, eventually a road fireman, and depending on their aptitude, they could go further, they could become a driver, and the top of the pops always was a salaried driver who would be a driver of the extra special passenger trains. He would have a fixed timetable. The general wages employees, unfortunately, they were on a 24-hour roster 7 days a week, so they could work any time during that period. Behind me we have the last surviving Ruffle Saloon dating from 1873. There were 4 of these built by Peter Nicol Russell and Company in Darling Harbour in Sydney. That was one of the very early engineering firms that was established to build railway equipment. Of the 4, this is the first built and the only surviving example. It is not 100% intact. The underframe was removed and destroyed and a similar underframe put under it, but the timber work of the body is original. This is used by the group that owns this as their accommodation when they come down here to Goulburn to do work on their other carriages. This is a carriage from the 1890s. It is mostly in original condition. Fortunately, it has been preserved. At one time, we understand it was included in set number 1. This shows the original cladding of the outside of these carriages, which we know as board and batten, and they are complete timbers that were milled and manufactured from a rainforest or a forest. There are cedar panels, various other panels. The railways and their contractors produced over 400 of these. There are very few in remaining condition. This usually would be used as a ganger's quad. We had quads and trikes. They were always painted red. These were actually built in Goulburn at our Purway workshops, I understand it. They had a motorcycle engine, which usually drove one axle. They were fairly light, so the operators could actually lift them off the track when a train was coming to get them out of the way. Occasionally there were accidents where they got caught up with a special train, and unfortunately, well, maybe for their own safety, if your train was coming, you wouldn't try and get this off the track, you'd just jump off and try and get out of the area. Hanger would do a report, he'd allocate some work, and then the work crews would travel out in these. I think this is a 6-seater. We usually have a little trolley on behind, and the trolley would have all the equipment that was needed to do the repairs. Again, they're able to be lifted off. This one would probably require 4 people to lift it, so it could be lifted off the track where the work was underway. And the work crew would actually stand aside while the trains went past, which led to sometimes a lot of people saying, look at all those silly workers not doing any work, just standing there watching the train go past. Well, it's very hard to work on the track when there's a train going past, so I can understand why they stood aside. Okay, this is our 90-foot, approximately 27-metre turntable. It is normally powered by electricity. It has 2 motors which drive it diagonally opposite, plus there is also an air backup system. So you can use a lever to change the gearing to convert it from electrical operation to air operation. The air is usually provided by a compressor on a locomotive, or even we can use the air from the shed. That fills up the 2 tanks. Normally there would be up to 6 or 7 tanks, but like most pressure vessels, they eventually do fail, so we only have 2 that are serviceable at the moment. They're driven through, there are 4 wheels on each end. It is a large turntable, so it is a different design to the normal turntables, which are balanced in the centre. So this one can be turned at any point on the locomotive, but generally you try and put the locomotive in the centre of the turntable to try and make sure that there is equal weight on both ends. On the 30th of June 2013, Sunday night, about 11 p.m, a train load of canola seed was being made up at the workshop next door. Unfortunately, while the shunting was being undertaken to put that train back together, it was in two halves. A portion of it came up our arrival road by mistake. It derailed on a derailer, and unfortunately the crew kept pushing the train in a derailed state until it came up and came to our turntable, when one of the bogies dug into the deck and caused a full derailment. At the time, that was fortunate in a way, because when those two vehicles derailed, they pulled the air on the train, which meant that the train stopped, and then the crew came and found that they had caused a big problem. Took us about 2.5 years to get the turntable repaired. It is now mostly back in working order. Unfortunately, we had to replace a few of the old components with modern ones because the old components were no longer available. But we salvaged what we could. We have a new deck on the turntable, so that's given us another 10 to 20 years of life on the decking, which we are most grateful for. This is one of the two Craven Cranes that were purchased in 1929 for the New South Wales Railways, to complement the introduction of the 57 class, which were too heavy for existing cranes which did not have enough capacity. These two cranes were manufactured in Manchester in the United Kingdom by Craven Brothers, a well-known railway crane manufacturing company, and they were imported by ship and put into service. Our crane here is number 1072, which spent most of its working life at Broadmeadow. 1073 spent most of its working life at Enfield and later Dealek. Sometime around about the 1980s, the two were swapped over, and our crane was at Dealek when the facility was taken over by Pacific National. Had not been used for many years, and eventually when Pacific National changed their operating model, they decided to close Dealek Locomotive Depot and dispose of this crane. Fortunately, they chose us to donate it to, and we paid to have it brought down and have kept it undercover since it arrived, and we are in the process now. We have done mostly a full repaint. It is not in working order. It would be too expensive to put it in working order, but we are intent on keeping it and preserving it as long as possible. This locomotive I'm standing in front of is known as 42105. It was one of a 10 421 class built in 1965 at Clyde Engineering at Granville in Sydney. They were mostly retired in the 1980s, and they have subsequently gone on to newer owners. This one has gone through a number of owners, currently owned by Chumrail, and it is in the process of restoration to running order. And it is painted in the former Northern Rivers Railroad paint scheme from the 1990s, and it's probably now a month or two away from going back into service. We have a lot of small companies or individuals who have a passion about railway locomotives, and they've bought these old locomotives with the idea of eventually restoring them to service. So this one's had a full overhaul. They're still fiddling around with some of the components to make sure everything is reliable and working properly. For instance, you can see some sand that they've used the sanders to check that they're working properly. These have double cabs, some of the very early versions of mainline locomotives with double cabs. They have a streamlined cab at the number 1 end and a blind or flat cab at the number 2 end. This area we call high roads, or our high road area. There are 6 roads in here, and this was upgraded in 1965 specifically to upgrade the facilities for the diesel fitters to maintain our 48 class diesel electrics. Gives you a bit of an idea of the downsizing of this depot, that instead of 42 roads, we only needed 6 roads for the 48 class. They were far more reliable, they could be in service 24/7, and they were new. So they ran very, very well, and they were very reliable. So part of the arrangement here was we excavated the floor for these 3 roads, and we put in 3 level pits. The top platform is the reason we give this name the high level, or high road, because it's built to the same height as the engine room in a diesel electric, which is about 1 metre higher than a passenger platform. So it made the facilities very good for the people that worked in here. Also with this, we lined the ceiling and we put doors on the front. So This area could be closed off in winter to make the environment far more comfortable for the people that worked in here, which was taken into railway workshops and converted back as close as possible to its original appearance. At the same time, it was given its original running number. So here we are standing underneath the boiler and the firebox. Part of a cosmetic restoration, the firebox components were not completely reinstalled. The locomotive has been static since 1957, was towed to Sydney in 1963 upon the arrival of our 48 class, and then fortunately was included in the collection of the Rail Transport Museum. This is a former mail sorting van or travelling post office. There were 11 of these built in 1914. The railways by that time had been carrying mails ever since they first connected with the Victorian system in 1881 at Albury. And these were upgraded, so these were built to this configuration specifically for this task, and the mail trains usually ran throughout the system in New South Wales, either 6 or 7 nights a week. For instance, here in Goulburn, we had 3 mail trains going through in each direction virtually every night of the week. Trains such as the Cooma Mail, the Temora Mail, the South West Mail and the Frome Mail were good examples. Not every mail train ran every night of the week. And at least one of these trains in each direction would have one of these mail sorting vans on. As the train went along, it would stop at virtually every station, and the local post office would send down some mail bags. The mail bags would be sent or directed towards Sydney or away from Sydney. They'd be put on the appropriate train. The bags would be taken into the sorting area, opened up and pre-sorted. You can see on most of the pigeonholes in there are names of various post offices. Once that mail had been pre-sorted, it would be rebagged in bags held in these big racks and then stored until they could be taken off at appropriate locations or either sent back or on-forwarded to other parts of the state. The last of these ran in 1988. By then, Australia Post, as it is called today, had decided that these systems were too antiquated, they were too expensive. There was usually a crew of 4 in here, so there were high labour costs, and they went to mechanised mail sorting, and most transport of mail is done by road today. This is a former CX dog box built in 1908. It has gone through 2 conversions since it was built. The first conversion was in the 1930s when it was converted to a CR corridor car, still with 6 compartments, but the improvements included toilets, individual compartments and end gangways, so for through connections to other carriages. It also underwent a second conversion in the 1970s when 3 compartments were removed and they were replaced with a guards compartment and a baggage and parcels area. Now the C prefix means that this was a composite car for first and second class passengers. Originally there were 4 second class and 2 first class. When it was rebuilt in the 1970s, the 3 compartments that were left became 1 first class compartment and 2 second class compartments for a maximum passenger carrying capacity of 22. But that was quite suitable for where this was planned to operate out in regional areas. Typically this could connect with a mail train at a major junction station such as Harden, and this carriage would be used either individually or as part of a mixed train, say for instance to head out in the Cowra line and service all the little communities along the way. It was last used, as I understand, by 1986, so it only saw about 10 years use in its current form. By then, the railway started winding back the services in country and regional areas. It came to Goulburn in 1989, and we've kept it under cover and in the condition it arrived in ever since.